My name is Dean Cavaretta, and we want to welcome you to a special Common Core Forum meeting tonight from Beverly, Massachusetts, in the Beverly Mass Library. Fantastic facility here tonight to discuss education reform and the issues surrounding Common Core. I'll be your moderator for tonight's event. The program will be about 60 minutes long. We'll try to get our guest speakers involved and invite your questions and have a good discussion about the future of ed reform, not only here in the Commonwealth, but throughout the country as well. I first want to introduce our panelists, or actually I should let you know that I am a certified social studies teacher in the Acton-Boxborough school systems. I became certified in 2002. I've taught every grade level from 8th grade to 12 in social studies and history, as well as coached at the high school level and substitute in different school systems. Our very special panel, and they are from right to left. Dr. Sandra Stotsky is an English language arts standard expert, a member of the Common Core Validation Committee, and a former senior associate commissioner in the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Mr. Jamie Gass is from the Pioneer Institute. He is the director of the Center for School Reform at Pioneer. Mr. Gass has framed, commissioned, and managed over 60 research papers and numerous policy events on K-12 education reform topics, as well as being published regularly in most newspapers in the Commonwealth. Donna Calorio, hi Donna. She is a former Worcester City School Board member. She's an adjunct sociology and psychology faculty member at Quinsigamond Community College, and she's also an MTA member. And during our program, we'll ask Donna to come up and talk about why she founded Common Core Forum. The website for Common Core Forum is www.commoncoreforum.org, and there's a lot of information on all the subjects that we'll be talking about here tonight. So without further ado, and I would let our panelists know that we want to balance both our opening statements with a Q&A back and forth. So using the moderator's privilege, I will maybe try to move the conversation along or suggest that we move on to a different topic if the interest creates itself. In terms of our opening statements, I think if we could try to do 15 to 20 minutes and then move it over to question and answers, that will get us within our time allotted. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Sandra Stotsky.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to speak to you here in the Beverly Public Library, which I haven't been to. I happen to have a very warm feeling towards public libraries because in Brookline, where I've lived for many years, I was a trustee of our public library for 14 years. And I've learned a lot about local public libraries in this country, especially those in Massachusetts, because they were among the first public libraries in the country. Let me begin by talking to you first about the philosophy behind the standards and related policies that affected teacher licensing regulations, licensure tests, and the other things that I was involved with when I was in the Department of Education here in Massachusetts from 1999 to 2003, because it's important for you to understand what was behind the standards that were essentially junked by your State Board of Education in 2010 when it chose to adopt Common Core standards in English and in math. I was hired in 1999 by David Driscoll, who was then the Commissioner of Education, and my first task was literally to completely revise your teacher licensing regulations in the state, because what was then in effect was just about incomprehensible to everybody. And we had standards now being developed since the passage of the Massachusetts Ed Reform Act in 93 to 94. I then found myself in charge of the revision or development of all the standards for K-12 for the major subjects. So I was able to dovetail these two projects together, including developing criteria, professional development, and other aspects of state policy that had some academic component to it. What philosophy did I bring to bear? A philosophy that I've had all my life, and which the commissioner and the Board of Education at that time agreed on, and that was the importance of content knowledge. I have always felt that that was the basis for the development of critical thinking. You cannot think about anything in an intellectual vacuum. So one of my driving factors for whatever I did was the need to embed as much content knowledge as possible into whatever standards I was responsible for, and into teacher preparation and into teacher licensure requirements, including their tests. I also had a philosophy that came from my having been an elementary teacher and then a high school teacher. The first in a small town in Massachusetts, Easton, Massachusetts, and then a high school that was in Maryland years later. And that was the need for getting everybody to do better. Did not think that we just needed to focus on the bottom. They needed help, but everybody needed to do better, because we have been going through what I would call a 50-year-old decline in the academic demands of K through 12. And this has been borne out by people who looked at the readability level of textbooks and other materials that were being used in schools. It's been documented in various ways, but the kinds of demands I had when I went to a small town high school here in Massachusetts, Bridgewater, were much higher than what was going on in the high schools by the time I was in the Department of Education. So my concern was how to build in stronger, more rigorous academic standards for everybody from K to 12. And the goal was to raise everybody, not necessarily to close gaps, because that goes in a different direction. I was trying to get everybody moving higher with a focus on content knowledge and whatever that would entail. I then became a member of Common Core's Validation Committee several years later. I retired from the department in 2003, did other things, and then was invited in 2009 to be on Common Core's Validation Committee, which meant that I was among the less than 30 people who were asked to ensure that Common Core's standards would be internationally benchmarked, research-based, and rigorous. And I was among the 5 of those less than 30 people who could not sign off on the standards for meeting those 3 criteria. One of the other members of the committee, the only mathematician on the committee, James Milgram from Stanford University. We used to talk a lot because we couldn't figure out what was going on the committee or with the standards. He looked at math, I looked at English, and we, together with 3 other people, would not sign off because there was no basis for the claim that they are comparable in quality to the best that's out there, even though that had been one of the charges that was made to the whole project, that we would end up with competitive standards with other high-achieving countries. We didn't. In math, as Professor Milgram, who has traveled with me to give talks and to give testimony wherever I do, according to him, the math standards end up about 2 to 3 grades behind what is the level in other high-achieving countries. He knows the math standards in other countries, particularly the Pacific Rim area, because he has been a professor for 40 years at Stanford. And we agreed they were certainly far from rigorous, even for what they did try to do. Let me begin with a few facts, which you may or may not know, just to make sure we all have the same background understanding of the Common Core project. And will you give me about 3-minute warning? There is a fact sheet on the table back there, Common Core Facts. It looks something like this. It's available on the web. Common Core is a project that was developed, the standards, by three private organizations in Washington, D.C., National Governors Association, CHIEV Incorporated, which is a spin-off of NGA, and CCSSO, Council for Chief State School Officers. These are three trade groups or groups that are involved as places for people with these positions to meet each other and to discuss policy, but they are private trade groups. And they were supported in the development of these standards by the Gates Foundation, a fourth private organization. What this means ultimately is that the whole project was developed by people who do not have any accountability to anybody. They are private. They do not have records that they need to make available, because I have tried and I've suggested to many reporters to try. But there are no records available as to why they chose the people they did to be on the committees, why they even chose the people to be on the validation committee that was formed, why they chose the writers of the standards. There were 3 lead writers for each set of standards. We don't have any information available, what their charge was, what they were paid, what their credentials were, nothing. And you can't get the information. There was no transparency whatsoever. And I'm afraid a little bit of that may be taking place right now with the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. No Child Left Behind was the 2002 version of that ESEA Act that came into existence in 1965 under President Lyndon B. Johnson as part of his war on poverty. It's been reauthorized several times since 1965, and they're now about 7 years late attempting to reauthorize it, but doing it in such a way that I would bet that hardly any of you know anything about the reauthorization taking place. And yet there is expected to be a vote on the House floor, a merging of the Senate and House versions in Congress by the end of this month. It will have a huge effect, just as No Child Left Behind has had. But there are some growing points of tension, contradiction, that are now being worked out. Few hearings, which certain kinds of groups were there, workforce groups, no parents so far, no academics talking about the quality of the standards, other kinds of issues. Very peculiar set of hearings, and I'm rather surprised at Representative John Klein from Minnesota, who's chairing the House version. Senator Lamar Alexander is chairing the Republican Senate version. And you can find versions available to look at. But the point is that there's no way, it seems, that they are looking for the people who have begun from coast to coast to be concerned and upset about Common Core standards to be able to testify about the problems and what they see as the issues. I've already raised some issues about the teacher quality part of it that was a striking part of No Child Left Behind. In any event, that reauthorization is taking place now, and it's going to have a huge effect on what happens with Common Core. So some of the things I will be talking about today may actually be changed in some way within a few weeks of today. We just don't know what's going to happen. You have to keep up day by day with whatever's happening. You have to run, as fast as possible just to stay where you are. And this is what's happening with No Child Left Behind. 2 minutes. Okay. Flaws you're going to be able to see on 2 handouts. I'm not going to spend much time talking about them, just making sure you know that if you want to see what the flaws in the math standards are, there is now a 6-page version from Professor Milgram, and it is quite readable And you can read the high school level if you know something about high school math. If you don't, that may be useful for you to think about, because state boards of education, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, many other groups have praised highly standards that most of them can't understand, because I do not understand high school math standards myself, even though I took these courses years ago. But in any event, this is the problem. Major problem, high school level with math, is there's no pathway to STEM careers, science, technology, engineering, math. You can see the flaws in the English language arts standards and other issues laid out in that page on ELA. So you have two sets of flawed standards, which the Board of Education, and I was on it, adopted in 2010 in Massachusetts, and this year will be the first year that tests based on those standards are going to be given in Massachusetts. And the crucial test, which the board asked for back then, was that the PARCC test, the acronym PARCC, that test should be at least as good as the old MCAS was. It's not clear how we're going to know, except that about half the communities in Massachusetts I want to continue with the MCAS test, which is based on Common Core standards by now, but at least has a pass score set here in Massachusetts, whereas the other half of the kids and communities are taking the PARCC test with a cut score set yet elsewhere, but we still don't know anything about it. At least I don't know anything more about where the cut score is for a test that is to be given in about 10 to 12 other states. And that's going to be the big issue we need to find out about. I haven't heard any more about where that pass score is going to be. In any event, that is going to be part of the tangle that we have been involved with in this state. How it has affected the Beverly schools, I don't know, because we would need someone from the Beverly schools to tell us what is happening, particularly in your high school, which is where the greatest damage will be. It will definitely damage whatever you had here, because we all know that we had among the best schools in the country here in Massachusetts because of the quality of the other standards that were dumped by your State Board of Ed. But what changes are being introduced by Common Core? Only your math and science chairs in your high school can really tell you, and your English chair in your high school can really tell you. Elementary may be all over the place because it will depend upon what grade someone is talking about and how much flexibility so far teachers have in the curriculum. But you need to look at those pages on math and English, at least to see that there are considerable differences between the first-rate standards you had and the inferior standards you now have. And I'll stop right now.
Thank you. Okay, our next speaker will be Jamie. I just wanted to make one comment. I think what's interesting, and we've done a lot of these so far to see some commonalities and themes emerge. We're talking about major changes in real time. In the public, before these forums, before Common Core Forum, were not fully abreast to the situation. I mean, we have members of the validation committee, like Dr. Stotsky, who she herself has had reservations, did not sign off on the final work product. I think that's something that we should always keep in mind as we go forward, because we're talking about what the content of the English standards will be. We're talking about what math will be the basis of instruction, what teachers will be teaching the kids. And what's interesting, when the school year starts, speaking from experience, I know we have other teachers up here, there's a million things going on, right? Parents are also very busy. This is the wrong time, we all believe up here, to be evaluating the changes in the curriculum, in the standards that are happening. So at the very least, we certainly all up here question process and question how in the world did some of the biggest changes to education occur, and why and how is it rolling out. And that's a perfect segue into Jamie, who can chronicle how we got here. Mr. Jamie Gass from Pioneer Institute.
So thanks, Dean, and I want to thank Donna and Michael and others and all of you for coming out on a cold night to listen to a topic that I think is, it's got, as you already got a sense of from Sandy, it's got a lot of ins and outs and details to it, but I think is enormously important. What I'm going to try to do is kind of give you some context of how it is that we got to the point where we're having this conversation. So again, just a reminder what Common Core is, because the fact is that even though 40 some odd states have adopted, and Massachusetts is about 4 years into Common Core, the reality is that many people across the country, many parents, legislators, public officials really don't know very much about it. And what Common Core is, it's a set of English and math standards that were developed by the National Governors Association, which is a trade group from Washington, D.C., Council of Chief State School Officers, which represents the commissioners of each state, and Achieve Inc., which was, as Sandy said, spun off from the Governors Association and financed by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They've spent about $200 million advocating for it, and many of the analyses that have been done on Common Core have been actually paid for by the Gates Foundation, which is the same organization that paid for the development of the standards. So there's a lot of instances of these players kind of playing judge and jury in their own case. And then Common Core will be matched with, and you see the acronym behind here, PARC, which is the Partnership for the Assessment of College and Career Readiness, or something along those lines. Frankly, there's so many acronyms that are flying around the whole Common Core discussion that it's become an alphabet soup. But Achieve Inc. is the organization that developed the PARC, and I think the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is trying to kind of salt the path where PARC will replace the MCAS. So just to begin, I'm going to give you a quote from someone who knew a lot more about governance and a lot more about constitutionalism than I certainly ever will, and it's James Madison, who wrote the Constitution. He was called the father of the Constitution, drafted the outlines of the Constitution, and wrote the Bill of Rights. And this is what he wrote in 1792. If Congress may establish teachers in every state, county, and parish, and pay them out of the public treasury, they may take into their own hands the education of children, establishing in like manner schools throughout the Union. I would venture to declare it as my opinion, it would subvert the very foundation and transmute the very nature of the limited government established by the people of America. So, as I often say to audiences, the founders got a lot of things right. They understood that the national government is certainly competent to do the things that it's supposed to do in the area of foreign policy and trade and defense, but that most of the decisions that most intimately connect the lives of citizens, particularly K-12 education, is the proper legal and financial jurisdiction of states. And this arrangement of the federal government doing its appropriate functions and the states doing their appropriate functions is called federalism. It's a key component part of our Constitution, and has really been the basis for this country going from essentially a loose collection of colonies along the eastern seaboard to, over the last several hundred years, the most powerful country in the world. And these are things that foreign commentators for centuries have observed as unique about this country, that unlike Europe, where all the decision-making comes from kings and queens and czars and ministers and on high, that the decisions in a democracy come from the people. And particularly, I think, as the founders were wise about the importance of our democracy at the local level and the state level being a wellspring to perpetuate itself. And that's why they really created federalism. And the reality is that the country has done very well, but in the last 50 years, as Sandy mentioned, it's been in steady academic decline. So we previously were among the highest performing countries in the world, particularly in the area of mathematics and science. But it was clear by 1957 with Sputnik, which was when the Soviet Union launched the first satellite, but even in earnest into 1983 when President Reagan's U.S. Department of Education authored a report called The Nation at Risk that basically said that we were, had fallen from among the top tier to between 11th and 17th in the world. And so people across the political spectrum have come up with a variety of different remedies for that. But what that Nation at Risk report did not do was come up with lots of prescriptions from Washington, D.C. on how to solve these problems. Because again, even after a sort of steady growth of federal role in K-12 education, 90% of the funding for K-12 education comes from the state and local level. So the feds really contribute a minuscule amount. And so, some people said, oh, we need to have more school choice in the system. Some people said we need to have higher standards. Some people, mostly in Washington, D.C., and these trade groups that are around Common Core, for decades have been saying we need to have a set of national standards, testing, and curriculum the way they do in a lot of the countries in Western Europe. But what Massachusetts did in 1993 was really quite unique because it was a bipartisan compromise between Republican Governor Bill Weld and a couple of Democratic state legislators who had very close relationship with organized labor. They crafted the Ed Reform Act of 93, which basically put a lot more money into the system at both the state level and the local level in exchange for all the difficult things that people in K-12 education had not wanted to do. Things like high academic standards, accountability throughout the entire system, MCAS testing, so high stakes testing for a graduation requirement, teacher testing, so that the teachers and the students are held to the same level of academic excellence, and some charter schools, which basically inject some school choice. And this arrangement of the money in exchange for the high standards and accountability has basically taken this state from among the sort of slightly above average performing states to the highest performing state in the union. This is something that has exceeded the wildest expectations of the architects of the Ed Reform Law. And really there's two conversations that are going on. There's what Massachusetts has done in the last 20 years, which has led to historic gains on every single measure, both national and international measure you can imagine. And then there's the rest of the country, which is still stuck in the stagnation and decline that was articulated in the Nation at Risk report in 1983. But it's worth just noting, and Sandy talked a little bit about it, and she's probably being a little modest, but because she was the architect of it, the uniqueness of what Massachusetts did really was its standards. That is what set us apart from the rest of the country. And the students being held to account through the MCAS test. But one of the big fads that had kind of blown in and out of K-12 education, which from my point of view, has done an enormous amount of damage to public education and the credibility and the performance of education in this country, is this sort of soft skills workforce development outlook. What Sandy and the architects of Ed Reform did in Massachusetts is redirect it to basic English, mathematics, science, history. We weren't going to do fuzzy math. We weren't going to do soft skills. We weren't going to do all these other sort of faddish things. We were going to do high quality classic literature, poetry, and drama. The evidence is quite clear that the vocabulary, the sentences, the offerings in literature is better quality, and that it better prepares kids to learn how to read, but also have actual cultural knowledge from which they can draw for their rest of their academic careers, college life, right? I mean, things like Huckleberry Finn, Sherlock Holmes, Charles Dickens. You learn all about about friendship, about love, about tragedy, about comedy. These things that bind us together and make us human, right? And on the mathematics side, what they did was emulate the highest performing Pacific Rim countries and have made a commitment to having access to Algebra 1 start in 8th grade, which is what they do in California, or have done in California, and what they do in places like Japan and Hong Kong and Singapore. Well, what this commitment to high-quality mathematics, high-quality English language arts, there's a test called the NAEP test. It's the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's the nation's report card. Massachusetts has been number one in the country in every grade tested, every category tested for the last 5 administrations of it. No state has ever done it once, and we've done it 5 times in a row. In the area of international mathematics, there's a test called the TIMSS test. It's the gold standard for math and science testing. In 2007 and 2013, we were tied for number 1 in the world in 8th grade science, and among the top performing countries in the world in mathematics. And this is no small accomplishment. So when in 2009, the Obama administration came up with the idea of a race to the top, Massachusetts could, which is a federal grant program, the reality of it is they could have named it the race to be Massachusetts, because we were already number 1 and we were already internationally competitive. And given that we had a lot to lose, Pioneer Institute, where I work, which is an independent, nonpartisan think tank, has been around K-12 education in Massachusetts for 20 some odd years. We thought that someone ought to take a look at the component parts of Common Core to see what it's going to mean for the state. And so we enlisted Sandy and Professor Milgram and other experts, academic experts, with proven records in both mathematics and English and language arts in California and Massachusetts to take a look at Common Core against high standard states. And what they found in these exhaustive 40, 50-page reports, and they did 4 or 5 of them in sequence for us, is that, as Sandy said, they were of Common Core in both English and mathematics was of lower academic quality than what high standard states already had. So it wasn't going to be a race to the top for Massachusetts. It was going to be a race to the middle. It may benefit, in theory, places like Alabama or Louisiana or Arkansas or Mississippi, but not Massachusetts and probably not California and other high standard states. Specifically, Common Core cut the commitment to classic literature, poetry, and drama, and they cut access to Algebra 1 at 8th grade. So they ignored the evidence from Massachusetts and high standard states. The next piece of research that we looked at was the legality, because Sandy talked about some of the federal laws that govern K-12 education. And there are 3 federal laws that actually prohibit the federal government from advancing national standards testing and curriculum. It's the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, signed by Lyndon Johnson, the General Education Provision Act of 1970, signed by Richard Nixon, and then the enabling legislation that set up the U.S. Department of Education itself in 1979, which is signed by Jimmy Carter. In these federal laws, it makes it clear that the federal government may not fund or direct or validate or support or encourage or bully or anything the states into adopting national standards of testing. And that is precisely what has happened with Common Core. That's how states adopt it, through a federal grant program. Massachusetts got $250 million in exchange for discarding our higher proven standards. And then the PARCC testing consortia is a federally funded testing consortia. Again, this violates 3 federal laws. Sort of the final piece of it, and then I'll kind of wrap up very quickly, is the cost. Because even though 40 some odd states have adopted, even though there's been hundreds of millions of dollars pushing this for adoption and for advocacy, the fact is that none of the players, not the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, not the previous governor, not the Department of Education, the Board of Education, 95% of the departments of education, governors across the country, they actually never costed it out. What's going to cost to align or adopt Common Core? And from their point of view, at least the Fed's point of view, I mean, what does it matter to the Feds? They only pay for 10% of it anyway. This is going to get gobbled up by the states and localities. They're the ones that are going to pay for this. And our researchers came up with a figure of $16 billion for implementation of Common Core nationwide. And it's going to cost Massachusetts $350 million to do Common Core. That's after we have already spent over $100 billion over the last 20 years to have the best standards and the best performance in the country. I could go on and on. The good news of this is that there are a lot of states that are beginning to pull out. The PARCC testing consortia started off with 25 states. It's now down to 12. In the last couple weeks, the state of Mississippi, the lowest performing state in the union, they have pulled out of the PARCC. So there's states and places that have a lot less to lose than we do. We had the most to lose, which is why they wanted and needed to have Massachusetts. There are places like Oklahoma, Mississippi, Alabama, they've begun to pull out or try to figure out strategies to disentangle themselves. And so while I've given you a lot of information, I appreciate your patience. I hope that it's helpful, and I look forward to your questions. So thanks so much.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, before we hear from Donna and then go to our question and answer portion of the program, I do have a homework assignment for you. It's basically to begin thinking about questions for our Q&A period. And the reason why I wanted to do this now is because I wanted just to recap the experts we have on our panel and kind of maybe steer you towards some helpful questions that might be of use to our discussion, not only here for Beverly, but for also the North Shore. Sandy was an insider it's fair to say, in terms of the validation committee, in terms of being an expert on content, what teachers should teach for English, for math. Sandy has spent her career in that part of the equation, pardon the pun, right? She could be someone that we could discuss questions on content, on the proper pathways for algebra, geometry, what should be taught in English, at what grade. Those are the discussions that we as teachers want to have and we work on during professional development and also with administrators at the local level. Jamie has talked about the legality of this unprecedented change in federal education policy. Let's call it what it is. He can talk about Massachusetts' success. He can talk about the slippages that Pioneer has tracked since this new system has been adopted. And finally, for local officials, Jamie and all of the panel members can talk about costs. What is the cost, real and unreal, in terms of dollars and time and opportunity cost loss for changing what was working pretty well to something that's never been tried before? So that kind of segues into our final panel member, Donna Calorio, who's the founder of Common Core Forum, why she founded this organization, what is it all about, and what does it seek to do. And with that, Donna Calorio.
Thank you, Dean. Just a little brief history of how I came to get involved in Common Core and what our group Common Core Forum is about and what we're doing to help fight Common Core in the state of Massachusetts. In 2011, I ran for Worcester School Committee, and one of the questions that was asked pre-debate, because they gave us sort of a highlight of what our questions would be, was, what did you think about Common Core? So I quickly Googled it, and it said, basically the federal takeover education. So I ran up, did my debate, and I was like, I'm against it. So as I got elected and I started to learn a little bit more about Common Core, the first thing I noticed was that our budget in Worcester was increasing. We received more money every single year. And as our budget increased, interesting enough, our discretionary budget decreased. So we had less money to spend on the front lines. So we were gobbled up on all these different areas of our budget. And one of the things I looked at was the Common Core. What was it going to cost? How much was it going to cost in textbooks? Just in the park testing alone, I didn't realize if you have one computer in a room, that's okay. But when you have 30 computers in a room, you have to AC that room because of the heat that's given off. Now, who would know that? I didn't know that. So what's it going to cost to AC 44 schools in Worcester? What was it going to cost to bring the broadband in? These were definitely what we talked about, Dean, was cost. So in May of 2013, I was still serving on the school committee. I was in my house one day, and I was thinking about what could I do to bring an awareness to Worcester. I said, I'm going to have a Common Core forum. So as I gathered information, I got really panicky. I was thinking no one's going to show up. I invited Sandy. That's how we first met. And as it turned out, we had 125 people. The room was packed, and it was beginning of my journey on to educate the public. And the next year, in 2014, not even a year ago, in March, we also were having little pockets throughout the state that were starting to educate people, parents that were challenging school committee members, parents that were going up against legislators, teachers, union delegates that I had spoken in front of the EAW, which is the second largest teachers union in the state of Massachusetts. I had spoken at the MTA convention about Common Core and Park. And as I noticed that there were all these little pockets, but not one unified kind of umbrella organization. So I started Common Core Forum, which is a nonpartisan, parent, teacher, citizen, complete volunteer-based group. We receive no funding from anybody, not even the Bill Gates Foundation. So that's surprising, huh? Because everybody seems to be accepting money from him this day. So anyways, we started this group. We are made up of, I'd say, between 2,000 and 3,000 members throughout the state, and we just do these forums. We educate the public. And just to give you a little idea, last year there were 2 bills filed at the legislative level in the House that were against Common Core. Now we have 7 this year, one including the one that was sponsored by the Massachusetts Teachers Association. So we've come a long way in a year. We will support and we will work with our legislators to educate them on these bills. That's one of our goals this year. We also will work with the towns that will be putting a non-binding questions on their ballot. We will also work on helping parents stepping up to the plate to run for school committee. There are a lot of as we noticed last year, we did a lot of lobbying with school committee members to talk to them about the park and the MCAS, and it really surprised us how little they knew about Common Core. Almost nothing. And I said, you're a school committee member, how can you not know what Common Core is? Well, what's the big deal, you know? So we're realizing that we have a lot of outdated, antiquated school committee members that probably need to move right along. And we have those that are doing really well there, advocating for the children. But so we're going to help parents or even grandparents, anybody that feels that they have the passion to support the community and the kids in education. So that's one of our goals this year. And the other goal we have is we're going to continually run these forums. Last year, I think we ran about 30 of them. This year, we ran almost 4 or 5 this month already. And we will also we'll have a day on the Hill on April 15th, which we hopefully will recruit some of you to come up, help us to educate our legislative body. We'll have guest speakers there. We will start off the day, it'll be 9 to 12 or 9 to 1, and we'll organize, we will pass out information, and we will go door to door or room to all our legislative members to educate them on what Common Core in Park is. So we have a lot of goals for 2015. We have signs that, we have out in the community. Last year we had Common Core signs. This year we focused on opting out of park. That's the other thing you'll see back there, that we are encouraging parents, if you do not want to take the park pilot test, that you have the right not to take the test, no matter what your superintendent or Commissioner Chester says. So we're very active in the community, and if you have any questions, feel free to email us. We have a Facebook page, Common Core Forum. Very, very active. Shannon back there is probably our #1 administrator on that site, and she does our Twitter account, and we try to tweet out as much as we can. We try to stay very current and connected to other states, and so we're very involved. So like us on Facebook. We reached over 2,000, yes, this week. Yeah, good job, Shannon. So if you have any questions, you can see me afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, lots to talk about, a lot of things to go back and revisit. I think one thing that's been interesting as these forums have gone on is it's both a mix of U.S. public education policy and the history of that with what's going on in Massachusetts, with the political wins here in Massachusetts, combined with what's happening at the local level, what is the proper role of all of these different stakeholders, and so let's see if we can break down some of that tonight. So I have a few questions during the speaking part, and I'm going to use my prerogative to ask our panel. The first question goes to Jamie Gass. I think, Jamie, I asked this at a different forum, so ask you to answer this and then comment on it. Did the Massachusetts legislature ever vote up or down on adopting the park pilot test?
No, they didn't. They had no hearings, no bills. No, there were no hearings or no bills in the Massachusetts legislature whatsoever, even though this is a major amendment, really, to the education reform law in 1993. And so, former Senate President Tom Birmingham, who was one of the architects of ed reform, he has been very clear that if he had been Senate President, they would not have done this. Former Governor Bill Weld, who signed the ed reform law in '93, has made it clear that he would never have signed off on this. And so, No, I think it's one of the really peculiar features of Common Core is that, as Sandy mentioned, these were really developed by private trade organizations from Washington, D.C. that aren't accountable to the public in any way, shape, or form. And I think really the goal with the Common Core and the park testing, which is also driven by a private entity outside of the reach, is to put the standards and the testing outside of the public accountability of governors, state legislators, I think ultimately over time boards of ed or commissioners, that this will be something that'll be out of the reach of public accountability. And irrespective of your opinion on it or your political persuasion, that's a troubling development. It's a troubling development because public education in this country, as I mentioned at the beginning, was set up to be a wellspring to perpetuate the ideals of our democracy. And if the adults that are driving it are brushing aside federal laws and trying to put it so it's out of the public realm of public accountability and transparency, that is shocking. It's a shocking anti-civics lesson for our kids, and it's a bad sign, frankly, of what's to come. Because if they're doing this at the early stages when they're implementing it, once it's got a sort of full steam, head of steam behind it, who's going to be able to really stop it? Who is going to be able to, what governor is going to say, we don't like those test questions, or we don't like the kinds of books that you are being taught in our schools, and the governor will just be one of a group of governors that has, a seat at the table. But under the prior arrangement, we own the table. MCAS was developed right across the border in New Hampshire by Measured Progress, and it was a state contract. So if we didn't like it, you just get a new vendor, or you make revisions to it because the Department of Ed ran it. If Massachusetts wants to make any changes to park, it has to consult with the people in Louisiana and Mississippi about it. And the disparity between the performance of Massachusetts and Mississippi is so huge. It's to be talking about two different countries in lots of ways. So.
Okay, the next question is to Dr. Stotsky. Sandy, how does curriculum standards impact my lesson plans, classroom learning, and high-stakes testing?
Standards are intended to guide the shape of the curriculum. That is the point of having standards, and they were embedded in documents that were called curriculum frameworks. That was the point. Standards are there to help the teacher choose what specific works or texts or textbooks, as the case may be. What the teacher is going to use is the local curriculum. The standards are supposed to be the intellectual objectives or goals, so they are intended to shape it. And for high-stakes testing, which is what our grade 10 MCAS has been because it's used for the high school competency determination, it's important for the school system to be on top of what is happening and for teachers to be aware and students to know that indeed if they pass the test, because there are 4 levels, 4 categories, then the 3 top ones will mean that they will get their high school diploma if they meet all the other requirements. If they don't pass it, they can take the test over again until they do while they're still in high school. But the high stakes now under Common Core have what is possibly a more sinister aspect. They have, under Secretary of Education Arne Duncan's ideas, become a measure of the teacher's worth, and they have become an instrument, the test scores, for evaluating teachers. No Child Left Behind used its scores to evaluate schools and school districts. The envelope has been pushed further under the door, and now Common Core's test results will be used to evaluate teachers. Parents and students themselves are not to be held accountable for the tests that kids take, the scores they get. It's the teacher who will be hung up on the yardarm. So, and this is what has suddenly occurred in the past year or so to unions and groups of teachers across the country as they have suddenly realized that they are the only ones who are actually going to be punished in some way by what happens with student tests scores. It will be from maybe in some states 10% of their evaluation to 50% in others. This is something that's being worked out right now as we talk. It's a game that's in progress. Some states have passed laws, like Colorado, that made 50% of the student test scores count for teachers' evaluation. Indiana's state board is right now having a struggle because it allowed local districts to decide, and some made 10% and some made 50%, and now they want to make it the same amount across the state, and they don't know whether to go with 50 or with 10. But one of the issues is, why should teachers be held accountable at all for a test they had no input into, do not see, cannot vet, and cannot do anything with, cannot change? It's a very peculiar situation legally, as far as I'm concerned. How the unions ever bought into it in the first place is a big mystery to me, but that's something they have to answer to. They were given Gates money in 2010, we know that, but I don't know how they expected their membership to go along with that kind of high-stakes accountability, where they're the scapegoats. There are a lot of puzzling aspects over the complete buy-in for this whole project and the way it was shaped.
Okay, so questions from the audience. I think we've certainly given you a lot of specifics, things that are in real time. For example, we are in a state where it's fair to say that about 50% of the school districts have voted to administer MCAS for another school year, and 50% of the school districts have voted to administer the pilot PARCC tests. And we say pilot because MCAS, Dr. Stosky, is still the graduation requirement. So just from a process point of view, it would give people kind of a gloss over the fact that the implementation piece of this is really troubling or just very confusing. It certainly will lead to future questions, and we hope future forums and more questions to be asked of our elected leadership. Okay, with that, we will entertain questions for the panel. Yes, sir.
Why is MCAS so much better than PARCC?
Why is MCAS so much better than PARCC?
I'll take a quick crack at it. The reality is we don't know. We don't know, because unlike MCAS, which was developed in full light in Board of Ed meetings and hearings and discussions over the course of years, PARCC is really owned by Achieve Inc. That's the reality of it.
The details, I'm interested in the details. What is different
Right.
about the MCAS test that makes it so much better
Yep.
than the PARCC test? Not
Yep.
the transparency or lack
Yeah,
thereof.
yeah. So the fact, one turns on the other, because the fact is that the people who drive the PARCC testing are under no obligation to make any of this public. And the fact is that they largely haven't. But the two big differences is that MCAS is a 10th grade test that you have several times to pass by 12th grade, right? PARCC test will be an 11th grade test. It's unclear under MCAS, the test questions by law need to be released every year. They've been releasing fewer and fewer of them in the last several years, but under law, they're supposed to release the previous test questions. There's no obligation for a private organization like PARCC or Achieve to release the test questions to the public. So the reality of it is that much of it remains in a black box, because in the schools, as they've done pilots here in Massachusetts, the teachers are under a gag order to not talk about it. And, you know, I think one of the big things that we know, and it's actually one of the big cost drivers, is that the goal over time with PARCC is to have it done all online. So the biggest cost driver connected with this will be the enormous cost of adapting everything over to computers. Again, that's costs that will be absorbed by the localities, not even the state will fund that.
Let me just add a couple of things to what Jamie said to get at your question. The cut score is determined by the state of Massachusetts for MCAS, pass score, whereas the pass score for PARCC, or Smarter Balance, the other testing consortium, will be determined in some way, we still don't know yet, by the large group of states that are the members. So they have to negotiate about where they want the pass score to be, whatever the member states are for the particular consortium at the time they come to that decision-making point. So who sets the cut score is important. What I also mentioned earlier is that MCAS was developed by teachers in this state. This is not the case with Park. In fact, we don't know anything about who's really developed the items and who has vetted it. I do know that when I was in the Department of Ed, MCAS items were developed by committees of teachers because I went to their meetings. They could revise the test items, rewrite them if they needed to. I mean, I saw them doing that in English language arts. Choose the passages. We have no idea where the reading passages are coming from, what grade level they're going to be, because no one's going to be able to see the test except those who are taking it on a computer. So there is a certain amount of secrecy built in addition to what Jamie mentioned. Under the 93 MERA Act, test items had to be released and teachers and parents could see what items were used for high stakes in grade 10. Nobody's going to see these items. Samples will be given, but no one knows how representative the samples are because they could be cherry-picked. We have no way of knowing. There are huge differences between a larger test and a state-owned test that we know we had the best teachers in the state because we made sure that they were on these committees developing these items, which could be vetted, revised, whatever. And there's none of that taking place. So we don't know what we're buying. It's like buying a pig in a poke, an academic pig in a poke in a sense, because that is what bothers me. I've been trying for 5 years to find out where the passages are coming from. Can't get an answer on that. They're choosing them for whatever reasons they want.
I want to add one more thing to it because it is, I think, vitally important. So Achieve Inc. in Washington, D.C., they're the ones who set up the park. Achieve has been around for 20 years or so, and like the Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers and the major players that are both advocating and driving Common Core, they've never improved student achievement anywhere in over 20 years. Nowhere. There's no Massachusetts equivalent that these players that are advocating for this can point to and say, in that city, that state, that place, we have boosted student achievement. That is key. The other thing that's key is they've never done assessments before. They have done some work in the past on standards. They've never done student assessments. This is not something that they actually have any expertise in. And I would just submit that when you're making education policy for 50 million school children, it's not a very wise way to go about it if the people that are doing it have no experience doing it.
Well, my question is very much based on what has been discussed here. And without mentioning names and things, to what degree Pearson Book Company, which is no longer publishing as many books as it used to publish, involved with the lines that are put into the various schools and their promotion of these lines and the promotion that these tests, the Park exam, be taken on the computer and through line testing. This is all tied in together, it seems to me.
Okay, and I would just amend or add to your question a little bit for Donna. How does a school committee, Worcester, Beverly, work with the teaching staff and administration on the purchase of learning materials? I think that's an important sub-question too to ask. So Pearson, publishing, their impact and role with Park and Common Core, and how localities deal with learning materials.
Well, it depends on your school committee and your level of awareness. You know, some school committees are very much aware of what's happening and some are not. That's the bottom line. You know, you're asking, you know, do we want to vote on $5,000? I know one school district in particular, 2 years ago, just bought all brand new books. Not for Common Core. Now, Common Core this year, they are laying teachers off because they have to buy Common Core aligned materials. So what you're finding that this is all another budgetary thing that we looked at, and it's very difficult if you have a school committee that's just going along for the ride and they don't want to advocate for what's best for the children. So, I mean, it really depends on your own school committee. I don't know the Beverly School Committee, so I can't say anything.
I'm not involved with the Beverly School Committee now. I was a member of the school committee.
Okay.
But I am an educator.
Okay.
And I follow what's happening. And you're right, absolutely what you're saying is what I believe in. And I think it's time now that we start investigating rather than rubber stamping what's happening. And this is the way we have to go, and we have to investigate all these things. And I commend you for your program and getting the parents involved and different people involved in a Common Core effort to, let's say, disclose what there is there in Worcester and the area. And this is something we should be doing here on a local area, on a local level, in order to examine these things and to make these things clear. Because people really don't know. Only those that
Yeah,
are
in like Sandra said, the department heads are not even made aware. This is top down. This is between the Department of Ed to the superintendents to the school committees. And what we found time and time again, and there are thousands of school committee members throughout the state, that we found they knew very little about what a standard was. We're talking in June last year. We're not talking 10 years ago. We're talking recently. They do not have the expertise because most school committee members, let's face it, are not educators. They're not educators, and most school committee members aren't even parents or have kids in the system. So what you have is you have people that are fulfilling the civic responsibility, but they are not vested in the process themselves. So I commend you to say we need to start stepping up and questioning what's happening.
I want to add, because it's a great question. Look, K-12 education in this country is a $500 billion annual industry, right? There's a lot of money to be made in textbooks, in testing, et cetera. What we know in 2010 when Massachusetts adopted the Common Core, we know that the same people that paid for the development of the standards paid for the 3 evaluations that Commissioner Chester in Massachusetts relied upon to make the decision to adopt. That's, as I said earlier, an example of people playing judge and jury in their own case. We know from a Channel 5 news story in 2010 that Commissioner Chester was accepting, and his staff, before Massachusetts adopted, was accepting travel all over the country, and in some instances the world, paid for by the people that were the advocates. I mean, there are, I like to say in relation to this, the conflicts of interest have conflicts of interest. And there's so much money rolling around here, and folks like Pearson stand to benefit enormously from it. And in 2 states that are in PARC, so Louisiana, whose governor is fighting it currently, and in New Mexico, which is in PARC, there are currently lawsuits related to whether this constitutes bid rigging because Pearson owns the contract or will have the contract for PARC. And it's essentially a sidestepping of state procurement laws. I mean, it's a kind of a technical side of it. But the reality is that there's a lot of very troubling financial conflicts of interest that kick around this. And the Massachusetts, because our commissioner is both the commissioner of education and he's also the chair of the park.
Exactly.
That itself is a conflict of interest. And it's bizarre. I mean, this is the way they make policy in banana republics.
Absolutely.
You know,
That's why everybody in the state has to take the park exam, because he's imposed. And the superintendent.
But the teachers aren't taking it.
Pardon?
The teachers aren't taking
No,
it.
they're
The
not.
teachers do not know what is on the exams they're giving your children.
Absolutely.
Maybe we should ask all elected school committee members in all of our localities to take it, because if they went to a car dealership, they would never drive a car without looking at the sticker. But at least with a new car, the sticker does enumerate what's in it. So we have more questions. This is good. Yes, right there. Hi.
I live in Gloucester, and I have, I don't know, like 1,000 questions, but I'll start with just one. The Massachusetts legislature never voted to formally adopt PARC, but each school committee has had the vote through the pilot program, right? So I think
Right.
in Gloucester, they are piloting it, and in Rockport, where my children actually school choice into, they are piloting it. And all these school committees are choosing it. But can a national law be imposed in our state without there ever being a formal adoption process? Because it seems to me that at some point, when they've done the trial run or whatever, the Massachusetts legislature is going to have to vote on it. No?
That was a very good question with multiple dimensions.
Yeah,
No,
I
it's a good
would
one.
say that you have to pay attention to the tentacles from the reauthorization of ESEA taking place now. Yeah, the No Child Left Behind Act as its original 1965 ESEA Act. Why? Because I see it as the first attempt to get Congress to pass laws that affect its distribution of Title I money. Now, if a state does not want Title I money, it is not required to apply for Title I money. But is there a state in the Union that doesn't want Title I money? I don't think there was one that didn't want Title I money from 1965 on. You see, that's why people can get away with saying it's voluntary, that the federal government is not imposing laws on the states. But if you read the draft versions, I've read only the Senate draft version, and I know that the House version is very similar to it, that if you read these versions, you will see that it gives a lot of power to state departments of education, takes away a lot of the authority of local school boards, even to the point that it tells what a local report card should look like. When I looked at that section, I was rather horrified because I thought if anything represents parents and local school committees about what their schools are all about, it's what the report card looks like. And here is the federal government in ESEA telling exactly what a report card must contain and look like. If the state wants to get Title I money, remember that, it's voluntary, you don't have to ask for Title I money. That's about 10% of the budget. Low-income communities would hardly ever be able to duck away. There may be smaller, well-heeled communities that can say we don't need Title I money in the state, but it's going to be the state that makes the application for Title I. So you just have to think about ESEA and its tentacles.
Aside from the federal, I want to just direct your question, is first of all, we're in the pilot year, okay? So when this came up, the superintendents were asked to directly, their directive from the Board of Ed was, we're going to vote on this in a year, which is in 2015, November 2015. The Board of Ed is supposedly going to vote whether to adopt the park with Commissioner Chester at the helm of it. So we really want you to take on the park as a pilot this year. So the directive to the superintendents was very strong. So before we got involved in it, a lot of school committee members were just going to go along with the recommendation from, probably that's what happened in Gloucester, from the superintendent. So what happened is they had a choice to pilot it this year, okay? Now Worcester, believe it or not, they let each school, 44 schools, each school decides. You want to talk about insanity. So you could have a child in one school, not another, but you don't know if your kid's going to be in Park and MCAS. How are you going to even equate how the district is going unless you have some kind of, gauge? Right. So what you're saying is that there was no vote. Remember, 2 signatures, as Jamie said, Commissioner and also to Deval Patrick. Governor Deval Patrick were the only 2 that signed us into Common Core. And then Chester was the one that put through this. There has been no legislative. No, and it doesn't have to, in order for us to have park, unless our legislature votes, we have 7 bills right now, unless our legislature trumps the Board of Ed, it's going to be the Board of Ed that decides whether we're going to have park. So,
fait accompli unless the legislature stands up and says no way.
or we have an executive order from our governor. He can trump it too. So we have, those are the pathways. Executive order from the governor, Board of Ed saying, oh, we don't want park anymore. Yeah, joke. Or we have the legislature that will pass something, or we could have a state bill. We could have a ballot initiative in 2016 that would be a binding question to get us out of park and Common Core via voters. So there are means to get to that, but and then we have the reauthorization that was just thrown at us, trying to trump all the states and saying, we don't care what you're doing on a local level, we don't care. We're going to make sure we embed this into this reauthorization so you have no choice in the matter, correct?
Well,
Yeah.
if Congress passes it by the end of February, they've trumped
Everything.
all the states. That's the nature of our form of government.
Yeah, there certainly will be public policy domino effects, starting with the Congress and then spilling downward throughout the two fiscal years, the federal fiscal year and the state fiscal year. Okay, before we get to more questions, and I think our pace of questions has gone up, I think more people are starting to come up with good ones. Just a quick note, we want to thank a couple people that put tonight together. I want to thank Michael Gendre and Jim Avalon for their coordination of tonight. We want to thank BevCam. We want to thank the library staff. We want to acknowledge some Common Core Forum members that are here: Elaine Apple, Shannon Dahlstrom, Donna, myself, as well as Tim Hezzy and Clay Evans on audiovisual. And with that, we will return to our questions.
One more thing I'd like to say.
Yes.
I'd like to thank Senator Joan Levy for showing up, and also Councilor at Large Matt St. Hilaire. He's here also.
Oh, the council is going to have the floor in a second, so we thank him for being here. But we want to let everyone know, both at home and in our audience, that we invited local officials. We invited elected state representatives and senators to participate. And before we get to Matt, I want to invite anyone to speak in favor of Park or Common Core or have any comment on that piece of the debate. Okay, just wanted to make sure that we took time to have that. Anyone who wants to speak positively or have a comment on what they feel might be something worthwhile.
Are there teachers in the audience?
Are there teachers in the audience? Show of hands.
I'm a teacher, former teacher, I'm a certified teacher, but I know I'm.
You're not teaching now?
No, I-
Okay, in the
young
Common
children.
Core. You
I
are.
used to teach you.
Oh, you used to, but you're not teaching now in a Common Core classroom.
Okay, with that, our next question and comment, Councilor Matt St. Hilaire.
Thank you, Dean. I just wanted to say thank you for organizing this. I think a lot of parents and teachers in Beverly have had questions about this, so appreciate the, spreading information basically. So, as an elected official, I think the last question was really getting to where I'm coming from is, what are the decisions that you made that impact?
Yeah, that's a very good one. Where do we go from here? Where are we in the process right now? And Sandy,
I have something, I've been writing about this almost every day. First thing is that there should be public deliberations of ESEA, more hearings. They're trying to fast track the reauthorization bills and have a vote on the floor of Congress by the end of February this month. Now, nobody knows, hardly anyone, what's in it. And what I have said, at least in one of my blogs, is that because I'm a town meeting person, I was a town meeting member in Brookline as well for 10 years, is that there must be public deliberations in every single school district in this country about what the contents of that bill is, what its implications are. It is true, it's voluntary in the sense that no state must apply for Title I money, but given the reality, we know that every state will, and then it will be under whatever the strictures and conditions are for getting that money. So you can be telling our national senators and our congresspeople, whoever they are in every state, that this is what needs to be done, and it shouldn't be fast-tracked.
No, Jamie, just comment on how ESEA opens up the door for testing, or how it lays the groundwork for testing.
How does it relate to Common Core?
Oh, how's the testing? That's the
Well, I mean,
argument right now.
the Elementary and Secondary Education Act is it's the funding and the mechanism for basically federal law around K-12 education, and it has an enormous amount of impact on states having to have standards and states having to have a test. And it hasn't been, as Sandy said, hasn't been reauthorized in 7 years. I mean, the Congress and the President have not been able to get their act together. And Sandy's more, I guess, optimistic in some respects, saying that they think it's going to get authorized quickly. I'm not so sure.
It's not optimism.
I know. I'm saying you're optimistic that it'll.
It's fear.
But
they're doing it without any discussion.
you think it's going to happen. I'm not so sure that I'm not sure it's going to happen. But in terms of your question, frankly, the most immediate thing is that Massachusetts has not adopted PARCC yet. Right? We still have MCAS. That is the state test in Massachusetts. And in 2010, as a candidate, Governor Baker ran against the adoption of PARCC and Common Core. He's been a little less clear about that this time around. And I submit that he was on the Board of Education when Massachusetts developed the standards and developed the testing. He knows very well, how successful it's been here in Massachusetts. And in fact, I think he was the only person to testify in front of the Board of Education in 2010 against it. And I would just encourage you, whether it's the governor or whether it is state legislators, make your voices known to them. Because that's the way public official of either party operates. You have to make them hear. And whether it's calling it on radio shows or whether it's going to the Board of Ed or whether it's calling into the governor's office or the state legislators, I think that there is a growing energy around this. The Massachusetts Teachers Union new president is anti-Common Core and anti-PARCC. And I think even in the last 6 months or so, really due to the efforts of Donna and Dean and others, it's gotten more and more traction. I think we've probably done 30 or 40 events in the last 6 to 9 months or so. So it's getting more and more traction. And I guess what I'm saying is that I would encourage people to impress upon the elected officials to try to do the right thing for Massachusetts.
Could I speak about the testing?
Yep.
Because the testing issue is one of the contentious issues right now that is being debated. And this will be part of what is being hammered out within maybe a week or so, if not sooner. Part of the original draft that I saw was going to allow states the option of keeping with NCLB's testing framework, which was from 3 to 8 plus 1 at high school, which could be a science test at high school, but every grade from 3 to 8, or for states to have some choice in what grades and in what subjects they would do testing. It was still mandating testing, but it was giving more flexibility to the states to choose. Right now, I have just finished writing about one of the papers at a hearing that took place on January 21st by someone who was saying we need testing every single year. Common Core, if you do not know, goes from kindergarten up through grade 8 and then has a high school test, grade 11. So it expanded the testing framework that was there under No Child Left Behind. What may be a compromise is to figure out whether to offer the option to states or not, or to say you're going to have 3 through 8 as in No Child Left Behind plus 1 grade in high school for the 3 subjects, English, math, and science, or to confine it just to English and math and say it has to be at every other grade level. It can be a grade span, not at the grade level. But that is right now what is being contended, and Secretary of State Duncan has already said he's going to be very unhappy with the bill, no matter what comes to President Obama's desk. So this is all right now in the works, and nobody really knows what is going on except the people in these committees.
I know Donna wants to comment on this, and I just want to dovetail it with another question is, what are you hearing from union members, from teachers, from localities about the number of tests?
Okay, well, first thing is I just want to add to your question, what are we looking for? Sandy, you mentioned it, you just forgot it, is the science standards. No, absolutely not. They're trying to push the science standards. We have English and math right now.
It's a separate one. It's not
Yeah.
Common Core, but it's aligned.
It's aligned to Common Core. It's called Next Generation. So you want to look at, things that are beforehand. See, the good thing, let's look at the good thing, because I always look at the glass half full, is that 4 or 5 years ago, how many here would be this vested in education? Raise your hand. Maybe a couple, right? But what we have, we awakened many activists in the area, and especially Dean said about the teachers. I have spoken in front of the MTA, I've spoken in front of the EAW, second largest teachers union in the state, and the teachers are really out of their minds. You know, their hands are tied. And remember, you have to understand, it's not like you are all here and you can speak freely. A teacher will be, penalized, because you remember that a principal sometimes puts students in their room or gives them special assignments. There's a lot of things, and I did substitute teach in K through 12, so I do understand the mechanism behind it. So teachers are afraid to speak up. They're just going to go in and do their thing. Now, if they're a union delegate, they have some protection. So union delegates will, when I addressed the union delegation in Worcester, and there's about 80 to 100 of them, because they're not afraid to speak up. So what you're saying is that there's a lot of they're terrified. They don't know what to do. They want to speak out, but they can't. They're just, their hands are tied. So I hope it.
Rick.
Many years ago, when I was in East Germany, going through the Russians were in control, they wanted my name, rent, social security number, date of birth. Now, data collection is what they're doing with Common Core now. What's the minimum by law they're only allowed to ask or take the information from students?
There really isn't any minimum by law. There have been a number of states in the past several months that have tried to develop privacy laws. And so far as I know from a good lawyer down in Georgia who's been advising them, there really isn't any such thing as a good airtight bill that can protect on the privacy issue. As soon as a kid goes to a computer to take a test, the kid has to put in name, teacher's name, grade, probably the kid's age or something like that, and immediately there is electronically available data that can be used to identify the child. And I've been told, these are all secondary or tertiary sources, that sometimes in the middle of some of the testing, pilot testing, a question will appear asking for personal information, and young children do not understand that they shouldn't be answering it. So information can come in various ways. Parents have reported being asked when they register their child for school that certain information gets immediately typed in electronically into a computer. And it appears to be about over 400 pieces of information ultimately that will be available, including a merging of databases, medical records, criminal records, other kinds of information. No one knows exactly what all of this is being used for except workforce planning, which is where all of this is taking place, the reauthorization of ESEA. But we really don't know a great deal of information. We only get bits and spurts coming out.
You know, that might be one of the themes on a lot of what we talked about. To what end? I mean, you could have that debate over testing itself. To what end is testing, and the Congress going to debate that, and what are we looking to do? To what end on data collection? Again, a lot of work and homework for our elected officials at all levels. So the hour is, we're at 8:10, so I think we go to 8:15 or entertain a few more questions. Yes.
Thank you for coming. So I have, like you said, a ton of questions, but I wanted to ask some specific about the infiltration of the changes are in the textbook that we talked about. It's also in our standardized testing for kids getting into school. The SATs and ACTs are changing. This is the last year. Private schools are adopting the Common Core standards, whereas before they were not, MCAS compliant. So I just wondering, homeschoolers now are also trying to figure out how does this tie in.
Yes, I've been speaking to Will Estrada, who's head of the legal or
they're trying to be a
legal counsel
buffer
for
from that
homeschoolers.
and sort of give their kids a classical education still. And yet, when they want to go on to college, they're going to have to be tested and be fluent somehow with ACTs and STs. So it seems like the tentacles are already so deep in. Is there any way really to retract from it? And can you explain what impact that's going to have on really being able to
To summarize your question for our audience at home and on YouTube, the extent to which the changes are taking place and where are they being seen, that's the question.
And at a national, it's really at a national level with college placements and colleges. Do you think colleges are going to reject ACTs and SATs if the kids aren't passing them because
really what is it assessing? Because the tentacles of Common Core seem to be so deep at so many levels. It's not just graduating from high school, it's going on to college as well.
Where are the changes taking place, and how do you combat that? Well, they do say that sunlight is the greatest disinfectant.
Well, there's an attempt to establish facts on the ground as fast as possible. That is certainly true. And the link to higher ed is being worked out right now, often with Gates Foundation money to some community colleges. But you also have many faculties at higher education who know absolutely nothing about what is happening in K-12 because they do not understand that when a test is given in grade 11 and declares a child college ready, built into the Race to the Top application was an agreement that whether or not they accepted the money, just applying for it, meant they had to get signatures from chancellors or administrators in higher ed that college-ready students who went to college were accepted, applied, and then were accepted. That couldn't be controlled by a test in grade 11. But if they did go to college, they could take 4 credit courses in their freshman year. That was the prize. And then once they are in college with only credit-bearing courses that they are taking, the idea is that then they can get through within 4 to 5 years, because as you probably have picked up, one of the goals of all of this is to get more people with college degrees. Not how much they know, but to get the college degree, the diploma, for more and more people, so that it's a way of social engineering in a way. And the problem with math is that, and this is where it's most critical, why the mathematician has become very concerned, if you have a test at grade 11 that is set for a pass score at about between grade 8 Algebra 1, there is no way that student who might be accepted and becomes a college freshman can ever be a STEM major, not within 4 years. And it would be unlikely that they would take extra years to complete the math and science needed for any STEM major. So the effects will be ripple effects that will go through not only the undergraduate years, but the graduate programs and professional degree programs that depend upon making sure that students who go into engineering schools, for example, if they're not prepared to take calculus, which is the typical freshman course in an engineering college, we don't know what's going to happen at the other end. Engineering deans I've spoken to aren't sure either. They only know that there's a license that many engineers must take, and whether they can pass the license, we don't know yet. You see, all of this is being played out, but the ripple effects are throughout the entire system. And your very good question about where do you stop it, or how can you stop it? It can be stopped at the local level, because right now local school boards still have just about all the legal authority they had 400 years ago. ESEA cannot take that away unless a state applies for it and it is approved by some people at the state level. Well, because that is part of what's in SEA. It's to take away local school board authority, which in all the states, whether they were territories or colonies, they go back to a period of time when you had locally elected school boards who are still vested with the legal authority to determine curriculum, instruction, and standards.
But even if that doesn't pass and a school committee kept Park out or whatever, the kids still have to take the SAT.
Yes, only if a college requests it. There is a growing list of colleges, there are about 1,000 actually in the country, and I've seen the list, that don't need any tests. Personal interviews, essays they will take, and there is now pressure to have more colleges stop. That's one way. I also have heard of some efforts to develop an alternate type of SAT that would be in line with authentic academic requirements. That's competition. No, that wouldn't lower the bar if they're trying to develop an honest type of SAT that is developed by people in higher ed about what they think high school students should be taking before they are trying to get into particular programs at the college level. So there are some homeschoolers do have a legitimate concern, and this is something that I know Will Estrada told me that they are looking into for the ESEA, because that's exactly where the problem is at the college acceptance. If they can only go to colleges that don't require SATs, ACTs, or GEDs, which are also aligned now to Common Core. But the fact that all of this has happened so fast should arouse the suspicions of an awful lot of people. Why is everything, including Department of Defense
Jamie,
schools?
you can answer on both. Yes.
I just wanted to know, because I heard you mention states opting out of Common Core, and I know that a number of them have.
Yep.
However, a state like Indiana
Right.
has created their own standards,
Right.
which are very similar, if not
Right.
almost exactly like Common Core. So if Massachusetts
Right.
opts out, what happens?
Yep.
Who determines what the standards are?
So in a way, the previous question and this question are pretty aligned. It can be done. Look, there's a woman named Jenny White. She lives outside Oklahoma City. She was able to, by sheer force of will, with a group of moms, and incidentally, whether it's in Oklahoma or whether it's in Utah or Indiana or Alabama or Mississippi, the people that are often driving this, and 70% of the audience that we speak in front of, whether it's 5 people or 900 people, are moms and grandmothers, because they seem to kind of get this actually a lot better than, frankly, a lot of our politicians do. So it can be done. Of course, when you're dealing with the U.S. Department of Education or, the Gates Foundation, these people have a lot of money. And unfortunately, the way it's gotten in our political system is that people with a lot of money have a lot of influence, right? And so it's true, in Indiana, they did pull out. And they had a good opportunity to return to standards that were higher. They were like Massachusetts. They were one of a handful of states that had really high standards. And they had an opportunity to revert back to it. But, then the U.S. Department of Education starts to lean on them for a waiver from the No Child Left Behind law. Their governor wants to run for president. And so they begin to kind of massage things. And I guess, what it means for Massachusetts is that we're not like Oklahoma. We're not like a lot of states that have oil or lots of natural resources. We are a state that for our entire history has survived on our wits, our colleges and our universities and our hospitals and all of the technology fields. So if we decide to have middling standards, and we're at a real crossroads, we have a decision. We're either going to continue on the road that we've been for centuries, where we're a leader in education, or we're going to just be one of the pack. And I would just submit that it disproportionately negatively impacts a state like Massachusetts, which doesn't have lots of other natural resources to fall back on. And the key is the quality and the courage of political leadership. I mean, it's an age-old thing. Winston Churchill said it. In a democracy, the most important quality is courage. And, we've got an opportunity with a new Secretary of Education, a new governor, some new leadership in the legislature to be courageous and pick a path towards higher quality, or we can just be, one of the pack. It's a choice, right?
Could I just add, though, you really have to understand that there are games being played in all of these states that seem to be opting out, because I've been involved in almost all of them. And the problem for the public is that the media do not report the information properly. This is a different issue, and I don't want to go into where the problems are with the media, but they do not ask the kinds of questions one would expect. But in Indiana, for example, and in Oklahoma, because I know both of the situations, you have committees possibly in Indiana that were set up that are giving back warmed over Common Core. This is just happening in South Carolina, it's happened in Georgia, and also in Florida. The problem is the process for getting true, open-ended academic standards. I know what the process was in Massachusetts because I made sure that it took place in an open way, and we had academic consultants from higher ed who advised our committees to make sure that we had accurate and demanding standards. We had a math professor, for example, at Harvard who pro bono gave us his time every day to make sure we had accurate math standards at the appropriate level. But this is not happening in the other states. They are under their departments of ed, who then choose the people who will give back exactly what the bill that the legislature has passed has thrown out, Common Core. And so you get a warmed over version, as I say, of Common Core. And this is part of the problem, which ESEA, by the way, is trying to build in. It wants to give power for the development of new state academic standards to the departments of ed if the state wants Title I money. It knows that these departments of ed all throughout the country will make sure that the right people get on the committees and give back exactly what the department obviously wants, which would be Common Core standards, because it's got the tests already.
Right.
I mean, just think about it. Here is a bill that may come to the floor of Congress this month. Why would they want states to send and develop new standards when they've got a test based on Common Core that they want given that's all ready to go?
Especially if they want the data for something.
Well, they want the, yes,
They want the data for
they
it.
want the data for it, but they've got a test all ready to go, which was part of the ESEA, No Child Left Behind requirements. By the way, the original 1965 bill did not require testing. This is a bill that has been, an act that has been morphing ever since 1965. And its real morph was under President Bush in 2002, which expanded the testing framework, required all states to have standards. No one realized this was a huge camel's nose coming in under the tent. And then the Obama administration then puts the rest of the camel under the tent by expanding the testing framework and then doing even more with it, because it's got standards that have a national scope. It's not just a state's own standard. So you've had a morph from 1965 to worry about, with an act that started with the best of intentions, how to help disadvantaged kids. This still remains, by the way, our problem. And you have to keep thinking, since 1965, we have not solved the problem. No matter what we have done with ESEA, this is still the problem driving all of this to this day. And unless we have a national discussion about how we can best help underprivileged, low-income kids, the whole public school system is going to go to pieces for all the rest of the kids and them together, because even they are not benefiting from all the money that's been poured in since 1965. I mean, someone's got to start looking at the big picture. I've looked at the research recently. I asked people I knew who were involved, what is the research on the effectiveness of ESEA? I mean, that's a legitimate academic research question. I've read all the research within the past week. There is almost no benefit that has been found by eminent researchers who are, by the way, very partial to ESEA. There was a bump in grade 4 in math. That's all they've been able to find for low-income kids, a slight bump. Reading, nothing. The kids are reading today badly, and there's been no change with all of the money and all of the bills, reauthorizations since 1965. It hasn't made a dent in the reading problem. Isn't it time to have a national discussion on what could work better than whatever obviously has been tried and hasn't? Head Start has been evaluated, doesn't work. I mean, we know what doesn't work. So there should be some honesty about where do we invest money in education. We pay more per child than any other country in the world, by the way. So where do we put our money that will make a difference, so we're not facing this complete turnover of the education of all kids, rich, poor, low income, high income, for no avail? I mean, that's really, to me, the bottom line question. How do we get an honest discussion about how we help low income kids get a fair shot without destroying K-12 altogether?
Put you in charge.
It worked here in Massachusetts.
Okay, so that was a that was a definite, outstanding conclusion and wrap-up to our discussion, no question. And we promised that there'd be more questions than answers. This is very much in real time and to be continued. Our goal was to educate and inform, and to ask you to go and educate and inform your circles of influence. The work has just begun, and this issue is not going away by any stretch of the imagination. So we want to thank Beverly for being a good host. We ask you to go to commoncoreforum.org and pass the word that way, and certainly network with your colleagues to see if your community outside of Beverly, other places on the North Shore, would want a forum similar to this one. Thank you and good night.